This is an oral history interview with Mr. Nelson Trumbauer in his home on March 23, 1982. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mr. Trumbauer, where was your father born?
Black Hawk County, Iowa.
And what was his name?
Henry Milton Trumbauer.
And do you know where your mother was born?
Up at Princeton, Illinois.
And what was her name?
Frances Wilhelmina Lintner. That's her maiden name.
That's what I wanted. What type of work did they do?
My father was in their early marriage. He was a circuit rider and a minister of the gospel is what he was. Affiliated with the United Evangelical Church. And that's about all he ever did all my life, up until he retired.
Did your mother ever work outside the home?
No.
How long did they attend school?
Oh, I couldn't answer that. I don't know.
Do you know what type of training your father had to have to be a minister?
Well, it's a good many years ago. It isn't like it is since the turn of the century. I don't know that he graduated from any school as a theologian. I couldn't answer that.
What is the origin of your last name, Trumbauer?
Well, from the heritage, we came from the Netherlands and Germany. On the maternal side, there's some Welsh and English mixed in there if you go back generations.
Do you know when your first ancestors came to the United States?
Yes, Andrew Trumbauer came over here. See, that's what I mean. If I should have stuff to refresh my memory on, that's what my question was at first. See,
How many were in your family when you were growing up?
I had 5 sisters, no brothers.
And where did you grow up?
Well, being an itinerant minister, went from charge to charge. I was born in Otabold, Iowa, and then we moved to Minnesota, where he served a pastorate at Kimball Prairie. Then we came back to Iowa. We was at Dunkerton, Iowa, and at Shell Rock, Iowa. And then he went back to Minnesota again, to Odessa, Minnesota. He served a pastorate there. And then he served at Merrill, Iowa, Hinton, Iowa.
Did the church always supply a home for you?
Yeah.
What type of homes were they, generally?
Well, a house like this.
How big were most of the towns? Were they fairly small or?
Small, fairly small towns, yes. There was one when he served at Hinton, Iowa. That was a rural church. That was out in the country. But the rest were all in town.
Do you remember how they went about selecting a minister in those days?
All I know is the presiding elder made the appointments. I don't know what you mean by selecting a minister.
Well, I wondered how the congregation chose them in those days.
Oh, pretty depends on what denomination you're talking about. Some church organizations, the membership interviews and choose the pastor. The other one is appointed by the bishop.
And what was it in your father's case?
Bishop took care of it.
Did you work when you were a young boy?
Yes,
What did you do?
worked on a farm.
Doing what?
Farm work.
What did you do with your earnings?
Well, saved my money, and after I was old enough to think for myself, I saved my money so I could go to college.
Which did your parents stress the most? Hard work, religion, education, or a career?
Oh, I wouldn't say there's more emphasis on one than on the other. I think it was a well-balanced heritage that I inherited.
How often did you attend church since your father was a minister? How many services a week were there?
All depend. Like on Easter, we always had extra services, but the routine was, see, since he was in my early youth, as I remember, he was an itinerant minister, and he'd preach at one church in the morning and then drive in the afternoon and hold the evening service at another church, and then the next Sunday it would be reversed. He'd go to the other one, hold the morning service, and come back to where we lived, where the parsonage was, and hold the evening service.
Were there quite a lot, was a lot of your social life tied up in church activities?
Oh yes, that in my youth, church was the main activity of a community, both political, religious, and for the good of the community. That was a life center back in the youth. It isn't as it is today. We didn't have all these things in my youth that we have today. See, that was back before the days of the telephone.
Mm-hmm, right. What type of schooling did you have?
I went to grade school at each community where we lived, and then went to high school, and then after that I attended Western Union College at Lamars, Iowa. I took a commercial course out there, business administration.
And you had saved up the money from your working? Is that how you financed?
Yeah.
Did
I had some help from home, of course.
When did you first leave your parents' home and live on your own?
Well, that's kind of a sad chapter. See, my mother died when I was 7 years old. and my sisters were older than I. They kept house for my father, but the first 3 years of my life, I spent considerable time with my father's younger sister, and I stayed with them quite a bit. And also I spent some time with a family that was a friend of my father when we lived at Odessa, Minnesota, and I stayed with them the greater part of 3 years.
Did you live in a dorm when you went to college?
Yes,
How many years did you attend college?
3. Then the war broke out and I went to war.
What did you do in World War I?
Served in the Army.
Where?
Well, first when I was with the 88th Division, that was organized at Des Moines, Iowa, and an order came through. They wanted some clerical help down at the 87th Division, which at that time was Camp Pike, Arkansas, just out of Little Rock, and I went down there. I'd been in the service of supply there at Des Moines, Iowa, but I done the same work when I went down to Little Rock. I was in the supplies.
So you weren't overseas?
Yes.
Where?
Well, sure, we went overseas.
Well, when did you go overseas and where were you?
Well, we embarked on September the 19th, 1917, and we got stranded. The boat that I embarked on went aground in Philadelphia, and they took several days for them to get the thing loose, and we lost our convoy, so we laid in the harbor at the New York Narrows. Was there for nearly a month before we could pick up the next convoy. And when we did go, we went to England and went up the Manchester Ship Canal, and then went by train down to Southampton and across the English Channel. Our organization was put in the service of supplies, and that's all I did all the time I was in France, was in the service of supplies.
What exactly do you do in service of supplies?
Furnish the equipment to the rest of the army. Over there, everything was done by convoy, and are you familiar with what convoy work is?
Why didn't you tell us about it? Can you explain it?
Well, see, any shipment of anything is accompanied by a soldier. It don't make any difference if half a dozen fountain pens he could carry in his pocket that went up to headquarters, or whether it was a train carload of bathtubs that was going where they was building a hospital. Someone accompanied that. And no matter what you shipped, a soldier always went with the shipment, no matter where it was or what it was. And that was what our outfit did, was furnish the personnel to accompany all these shipments.
Did you end up near the front lines very often?
You know, never left the place. See, we were, those of us that was overseeing it were permanently stationed, you might say, because it's, the troops were quartered there. When you got your assignment, you sent the man out, and most of my work was to figure out what his assignment was. They had a formula that you used so much French money, and they always had to carry a certain amount of emergency rations in case it was needed, and that's what I did, to compute how far it was from our base to where he was assigned to convoy this shipment. As I said, regardless of what it was, a man always counted it, and that's what our work was, to route. And my personal job was to see that they had these rations, the trip that, according to the formula that we had, would figure out how much money they needed and how much emergency ration they would carry.
Where were you stationed in France?
Jeb's, France.
How long were you there?
Well, from September of 1917 until till the armistice was signed November 11th, 1918.
How long did it take you to go on the boat from here to France, besides being stuck in the harbor?
Oh, I don't remember just how many days it was. We was in a convoy, and I don't just recall how many days it did.
Did you get to do some traveling in France while you were there?
Not too much. When we were at Brest, France, I got to visit some of those chateaus that were there.
When you came back to this country, then were you out of the Army, or did you stay in for a while?
Not too long. Since I was the spy sergeant of the headquarters company, which was in charge of the military band, and we embarked at Hoboken, New Jersey, and the supplies there wouldn't take the band instruments, and since that was my responsibility, I had to take them down to Newark, New Jersey, and then I got transportation out to Des Moines, Iowa, and I was discharged out of Des Moines, Iowa again.
How do you feel that World War I changed life in the United States?
Well, when President Wilson told us that this was war to end wars, I believed it, and I felt it was my responsibility to do what I could to end war forever. But history shows that was not the case, and I guess we're involved today like they was in biblical times. It seems that a war is somewhere constantly. I give up hopes. I don't think that we'll ever be free from war.
When you came back to the United States, then after you were discharged, what did you do?
Well, I worked in the bank a short time, and then I went with the Burnham Manufacturing Company in Charles City, Iowa.
What did they make?
Farm items like that was before the days of the truck. And while I worked with them, the truck came into being after World War I, and the auto manufacturers just made a chassis, and we made beds for the trucks and cabs. Those things all came gradually. It was quite a hassle. I'd done cost accounting for the Burnham Manufacturing Company during this period of time, of course. But before the truck industry began to grow, they made stock tanks and grain beds for wagons, hay racks, swill carts for the hogs.
Do you remember what your first impression of the automobile was?
It was rather crude. There weren't too many passenger cars. It was a slow. Of course, we look back and say, "Oh, it grew fast," but at the time, it didn't seem that it was going too fast.
When you saw the first one, did you think it would catch on?
Oh, I don't think I had an opinion at that early age.
How long did you work for the company that you were just discussing?
About 4 years, I think.
And then what did you do?
Well, that's when the Depression came on, and agriculture was hurt very badly, and after World War I, agriculture was hurt in the 20s, and then the stock market crashed on October 29th, 1929, and from then on life was pretty rugged for a few years. That's when our company looked to me like was going to fail, and I went into the printing business, and that's how I came to Monticello in 1923. Worked for the old Monticello Bulletin.
What was it like during the Depression? Were you able to be employed most of the time?
I was never unemployed. I was very fortunate. Of course, their wages, as you know them today, was minute compared to what they make today. Of course, $1 was worth something then. You could buy $1 worth of groceries. You couldn't carry them home hardly.
What was your impression of President Roosevelt?
Well, you mean as president?
As president, when he decided he was going to end the Depression.
Oh, well, he started business rolling on borrowed money. We've been borrowing it ever since. We never have learned to live within our income. Where it's going to lead us to, it's hard to tell.
When you came back from World War I, they had just instituted prohibition. How did you feel about prohibition? What was it like?
Oh, in my area, there wasn't, we wasn't afflicted. I lived mostly in rural communities, and I don't recall that it was too much of a issue out there.
When did you meet your wife?
I met her in Charles City, Iowa in the fall of 1916. But then I went in the Army in April of, war was declared in April 1917, and then in September I went in the Army. And when I returned in 1919, I got back in the latter part of February. We were married June the 25th, 1919.
How did you happen to meet? How did you happen to meet your wife?
Well, my father was the minister, and I went to visit my father, and she happened to be the organist of his church. And just met her, I guess. Become acquainted.
What type of courtship did you have?
Beautiful.
Do you remember your first date?
Oh, yes. I took her home after church.
Did you have to ask her father's permission to court her?
Well, the unfortunate thing was her father died the result of an accident. He fell from a ladder. He died in 1910. She was only 16 years old at that time. So we didn't have, I never met her father, of course. She had a wonderful mother, though. I enjoyed her very much.
What was your wife's maiden name?
Horn.
Can you tell us her whole name?
Edna Mae Horn.
Do you know where she was born?
Charles City, Iowa.
So you were married in 1919 then?
Mm-hmm.
Where did you make your first home?
Charles City, Iowa.
And that's what place were you working then?
Burnham Manufacturing Company.
And then you said you got into the printing business. How did you happen to get into that?
The lady that was the Linotop operator here in Monticello, at the old Monticello Bulletin, was from Charles City, Iowa, and she wrote a letter up there. See, there was a Linotype school in Charles City, Iowa. When I seen there that the factory business was failing, I looked around what to do, and I thought I'd take up the printing business, which I did, and so I was just finishing a course in Linotype repair work and maintenance, and she called up there, wanted to know if any would want to come to Monticello and relieve her. And I was getting ready to take a job. I said if she could stay another week, I'd come down and take it, which she did, because she was from a Charles City girl, the same as where we were living at that time. And that's how I got to Monticello.
When did you come to Monticello then?
I came in middle of May 1923, and my good wife, she looked after the crating of the furniture. We had freight trains back in those days, and our furniture was shipped by freight from Charles City, Iowa to Monticello, Illinois. And there was no house for rent when we got here. She came about a month later. I stayed at the old Brady house for that month, and there wasn't any house available for rent for until September. We rented a house at 212 East Lincoln Street, and we lived there for 9 months, and then moved into which is now our current home. We rented it first and then bought it later.
So what did you do? What was your job here in Monticello?
Printing business, the old Monticello Bulletin. W.D. Higdon was the editor.
And what did you specifically do?
Well, it was a small print shop. Run the printing presses, run the linotype machine, set the type.
For a normal newspaper.
Oh, we'd start Monday morning and print it on Thursday and get it in the mail on Thursday.
The paper still just came out once a week then also.
Oh, sure. It was a weekly paper. And you did job printing and things like that besides the newspaper.
How long did you stay doing that job?
Until July of 1934, when I went to work for the Clinton Matty Tippett down at the Piatt County Republican. And I stayed with them until during World War II. First they appointed me on the ration board, and that's a volunteer job, but in so doing, some from the headquarters office in Springfield came through and frequently asked me to take a position with the Springfield office of the OPA. That stands for Office of Price Administration. And I went with them in March of 1945, but I was the chairman of the War Price and Rationing Board toward the last. I was co-chairman with Forrest Borden from the beginning. He made a mistake in using gasoline one time, and they relieved him of his responsibilities, and they wouldn't replace him, so I was the only one in charge of the Piatt County War Price and Rationing Board until I went with the district office in Springfield.
What exactly did you do on the board?
Ration. Are you familiar with the rationing period?
A little, but can you tell us some about it?
Well, we rationed almost everything. Tires, gasoline, shoes, sugar, meat. You know, you had your stamps, food stamps, and all that was, and there was a lot of people rallied to the government support. He supported the war effort in very fine shape. There was a lot of good citizens that did their job. He had, as chairman, he would oversee the committees that would ration the tires, the gasoline, the various committees would, so to speak, would take care of their end of it. Shoes were rationed and everything, you know.
Did people also have stamps for shoes and
Oh,
tires?
sure.
Just not the food? Besides
Well,
the food?
you had to have stamps to buy meat. You had meat stamps, sugar stamps, shoe stamps, and all that.
Did you receive notification from the government saying how many shoes would be allotted to Piatt County?
Oh, well, yes, you had a whole set of law books that regulated every move everybody made. Every citizen was covered in one form or another, and you had violations and you had problems, prosecutions, and things like that. You was a jack of all trades, so to speak. You did a lot of legal work without a license.
So that's what you did during the entire World War II?
Mm-hmm. Except I worked at my job until I went with the Office of Price Administration in March of 1945. They wanted me to go earlier. As I said, they come through every once in a while, at least once a month, and somebody had asked me to take a job with the Springfield office, but I felt the war would end someday, and we liked Monticello and intended to stay here, so I always put them off. And at the last, every time they come through, they'd offer you more money. So it became, coming from a poor family and so on, and offer you a good job with such remuneration was, I guess you could say it was a temptation. So I finally yielded and went with the Office of Price Administration.
When you worked did you work in Springfield?
Well, that was my headquarters. We never left Monticello. I was a field representative for them. I traveled.
Mm-hmm. How many people were on these various committees? How many, do you remember how
You
many?
mean locally here in our Monticello board? Oh, I wouldn't know. I imagine that all together there was 50, at least 50 or 60 people involved. There's a lot of work to be done. Stamps had to be issued. Committees had to run the various phases of rationing. Then you also had the price that came in. Prices were frozen. And of course there's always some that yield to temptation. So you have those things to contend with.
Where did people pick up their stamps?
At the courthouse, our office is in the basement of the courthouse. But for the safety of the stamps, the National Bank, we used their vaults over at the bank.
Do you remember how much a pair of shoes cost during World War II? Or a pound of sugar, or any of those things?
No, I don't remember what the price was. See, prices were frozen, and so they couldn't raise prices without being in violation. You held hearings on violations and things like that, which is a sort of a court system, you might say. You had the laws that passed by the Congress and signed by the President. And
if you were found in violation of the law, what happened to you?
all depends on what kind of, just like comparable to what happens today if somebody violates the law. It all depends on what kind of a crime it is. It all varies. It's a wide range, just the same as it is today. From
On just your position on the board, could you send someone to jail, or did they have to go through the regular court system?
oh, you know, if someone went to jail, that had to be handled by the legal department of the Office of Price Administration.
What did you do after World War II?
Well, when the Office of Price Administration folded out, well, first they used me to liquidate. Each county had an OPA office, and they had a staff, a paid staff, as well as all these volunteers. And I was one of several that was selected to liquidate the equipment in the offices. You had desks, typewriters, adding machines, a lot of supplies and things like that. And took about 6 weeks to liquidate it. And after that, I know at our last meeting that we had, they said, well, if any of you want to continue in government work, if we're passing out 3x5 cards, write your name and address on there, and if we can, we'll see what we can do for you and get you a job. So I thought, well, I don't have anything in mind, so I filled out a card, and I'd never used any of my vacation days that I had coming, so it'd been quite a strenuous job as far as that goes, and I told my good wife, I think we'll just take a vacation, so we did, and we was gone about 3 weeks, I think. And when I got back, I had a notice that to come to Springfield. They wanted to interview me. That they had some propositions for me. When I went down, I found that I could either get a job with the Internal Revenue Service. They had opening in Mattoon and Champaign, and with the Veterans Administration, they had an opening in Rockford. So they took me over to I said, well, if you leave it that way, I'll go to Champaign, because my home was in Monticello, and that's not very far away. We own our home, and I can commute. So that's how I got in the IRS.
What did you do in the IRS?
Oh, had a variety of jobs. The first thing we did was, of course, you got a course of instructions, and but audited income tax, and then on November 1st, 1951, Congress passed a law in which gambling, they set up a set of rules under which certain types of gambling would be taxable. And also it was learned that a lot of gamblers made a living gambling but never paid income tax. So they set up what they called a racket squad, and each district throughout the United States formed a squad of several Internal Revenue agents that formed this group, and they called us the Racket Squad for a nickname, and that's what we started out doing. But they gave us some other duties in conjunction with it. They had a lot of excise taxes that were put on during the war, and we also did a lot of excise tax audits as well as the wagering. But the wagering was, I would say, the major item. Also, we had another item that was quite revenue producing, and that was cabaret, where alcoholic beverages were sold. If you had entertainment other than instrumental or mechanical music, if it was accompanied by any other form of entertainment, it became taxable. The rate of tax varied considerable during the time that the cabaret tax was in effect. At one time it was as high as 30% on the receipts that were received during cabaret period. The proprietors set the hours of entertainment, and mostly it was for dancing, as he was the main. Of course, they'd have other things. You could have an orchestra with singing and etc., but dancing was the main. A lot of little places used a jukebox for the music to dance to, and therefore that made any sale of any merchandise made during the period of entertainment became taxable.
That would be hard to keep track of, I would think.
Oh, it was quite interesting. I learned how people lived on the other side of the tracks that I never knew before.
What would you think would be your most interesting case you ever worked on?
Well, I don't know, it depends on what standpoint you'd say interesting. They're all interesting, but do you mean from the revenue standpoint or from the good that it done as a moral issue? Depends on what you mean by that.
I just meant, what did you find the most personally interesting case you worked on?
Well, it goes back to the same thing. You mean money? The largest case?
Okay, why don't you tell us about that?
Oh, I had a gambler one time that wound up when he got through, his tax amounted to $1.25 million plus interest on it. He was a big gambler. So that was I guess you could say, an interesting case on what all was involved in it, but then also there's some interesting things happen in Cabaret. That was, I guess you could call that interesting or surprisingly, because you learn that all people aren't honest. And like they'd say, well, we have Cabaret from 7 to 9, and they might run till 2 o'clock in the morning, and they would only pay tax on their receipts from 7 to 9. So you'd have to investigate all that before you made the audit. So,
did you go out and investigate personally, or were there other people that were doing that part of it?
no, that was my job. I was the investigator. Then if I needed extra help, I'd have to ask the department for assistance if it got too big, see. But usually worked alone.
How long did you continue to work for the IRS?
Until I retired at the end of December 1965. You might say I retired January 1st, 1966.
To backtrack a little, when we talked about the food stamps, or the stamps during World War II, how often did people receive stamps?
According to the formula, whatever it was, like, for instance, rationing sugar, people got so many pounds during a course of a year, and every so often you got a food stamp and entitle you to a pound of sugar and so on. Or you got, couldn't begin to remember all the regulations, because you covered almost everything that you ate and everything you wore and you used, like your gasoline and tires and all that. I couldn't begin to remember all the details of that. Everything was covered except your breath. That's about the only thing that wasn't covered.
During your courtship days, in that period of your life, what type of when you went out on a date, what type of entertainment did you do? What are some things you did for fun?
Well, what's your definition of fun?
Well, go out and have a nice evening.
Well, you're doing the work that I did all the time was IRS. I'm not complaining, but today, as this generation has grown up with the union activities that have taken place, you can't do it. You wouldn't do it today. But see, you might say I was on duty 7 days a week, and it could be 24 hours a day. There was no, I'm not mentioning this as a regret or anything like that, but see, you had to investigate a case when it was operative, And that don't make any difference whether it was something that happened at 9 o'clock in the morning or if it happened at midnight or 5 o'clock in the morning. You would be there as the circumstances called for. So you was really, I don't know, you're pretty well tied down. Of course, you had a vacation. You took a vacation, probably 2 weeks at a time, and get away from it all, so to speak. But I have no regrets, though. I enjoyed it. It was quite an experience. Everybody doesn't have that opportunity.
No. How many children did you and your wife have?
One.
What is the child's name?
Gordon.
Where does he live now?
Fort Collins, Colorado.
Do you have any grandchildren?
2. David Steele Trumbauer and Stephen Allen Trumbauer.
What other organizations or community activities were you involved in Monticello?
Oh, I had, in the news, conjunction with the newspaper work, I had a wide range of activity with going back the community club, which preceded the Chamber of Commerce that you have today. I served on city council, various committees of the commercial club, and on the school board. We used to have 2 school districts, District 25 and School District 168, but they merged back some years ago. I served on both boards of education as a member, and on District 25 I served as president of that at one time. District 25 used to cover the grade schools, and 168 was the high school. But now that they merged, it's all one district, District 25 today.
How many years were you on the Board of Education?
Oh, altogether, I guess about 6-7 years.
What, can you give us an idea what time period, what the dates were?
What?
What years?
Oh, it had been back in the 30s up to about the late 30s to I think 1946, I believe, when my government work got too heavy and I resigned.
When were you on the city council?
Back in the 30s during the Depression, when the banks all closed. That was a pitiful experience. I don't know if you know from history, President Roosevelt, his first act when he became president, he was sworn in on the 4th of March, 1933, and on the 5th, declared a bank moratorium and closed every bank in the United States because we'd had so many bank failures that I think he done a wise thing when he done it. And but we here in Monticello was without a bank for some months, but the B-Mint Bank and the Isedale Bank opened, and we, as I formerly mentioned, came from Charles City, Iowa, and we had property in Charles City and had them pay at the bank. One bank was opened immediately and the other one closed before the bank moratorium. As well as the banks here, we had funds in both Monticello banks, and the Moore Bank closed before the National Bank did. And the bank in Iowa opened first, and so I knew Ralph Rose that was in the bank over at Isedale, and I went over there and wrote a check on the bank in Iowa and got funds through that.
How long were there no banks, or how long were both banks in Monticello closed then?
Oh, I don't remember exactly. I forget what day the National Bank opened. They had to reorganize. It was a whole new setup, see.
But they were without banks for a couple of months here.
Oh, yes. For some period, I forget just how many.
Did you lose any money?
Oh, sure. Everybody lost money in the Depression.
In the bank, so you didn't get your money back then?
No, you didn't get your money back. See, well, I don't know how much history you took or how much you know about civil government, but in my language, I'll say we had a revolution between the old way of doing business and what happened after the Depression. They changed the banking laws drastically, but we lost money in one of the banks in Iowa and one of the banks in the Moore Bank in Monticello, but the National Bank paid out 104%. So in my opinion, it should have been reopened. You see, under a formula, they permitted banks, if they were, I'm going to use the term safe, they let them reopen. It's only those that were in bad straits that were not permitted to reopen. See? I've always felt that the National Bank should have been